February 2022. The world watches Russia invade Ukraine, and every analyst, every strategist, every talking head on television offers the same explanation: military miscalculation, logistical collapse, failed intelligence. NATO underestimated Russian incompetence. Ukraine exceeded all expectations. But that's the surface story. That's what you see in the headlines. What nobody talks about, what the declassified documents later revealed, is that the first 120 minutes of the invasion weren't a failure. They were a catastrophe hidden inside a deliberate test. And the test wasn't designed to conquer Ukraine. It was designed to expose something far more dangerous: the breakdown of the entire Russian command structure before the war even really started. This isn't about armies colliding on battlefields. This is about what happens when the people supposed to be running a war are completely frozen by paranoia, corruption, and a single man's unpredictable calculations. Vladimir Putin made the decision to invade Ukraine alone, or mostly alone. His inner circle didn't know the timing. His military commanders didn't know the timing. Even elements of his own security apparatus were kept in the dark until hours before the operation commenced. This wasn't paranoia born from a healthy amount of caution. This was pathological compartmentalization. Putin had been systematically purging independent military thinkers for 2 decades. Every general with the audacity to question strategy, every admiral who wanted transparent budget allocation, every strategist who suggested long-term planning instead of personality cult administration, they were either retired, reassigned, or removed entirely. What remained was a command structure built on fear and loyalty, not competence. The invasion plan itself, Operation Z, as it became known internally, relied on an assumption that had never been tested at scale. It assumed that the first wave of airborne and special operations troops could secure critical objectives in Kyiv within hours. It assumed Ukrainian air defenses would be neutralized immediately. It assumed the political leadership would collapse before any serious fighting began. It assumed shock and awe would work in the 21st century the way people imagined it had worked in earlier campaigns. Those assumptions were generated by people who had never fought a real war against a prepared opponent. They were generated in isolation, in sealed rooms where nobody had the authority to disagree. But here's what the Russian command structure didn't account for. Ukrainian intelligence had penetrated their planning cycle. Ukraine knew the invasion was coming. Ukraine knew the timeline. Ukraine knew the objectives. Ukraine had spent weeks positioning defensive assets precisely where Russian first-wave troops would arrive, expecting minimal resistance. The transportation aircraft that were supposed to land elite paratroopers at Hostomel Airport near Kyiv ran into coordinated anti-aircraft fire that had been prepared specifically for that moment. The helicopter gunships that were supposed to suppress Ukrainian defenses found themselves in kill zones carefully constructed over the previous weeks. The special operations teams that were supposed to secure buildings and bridges found those buildings already prepared for defense. And none of this happened by accident. Ukrainian military intelligence, GUR, had sources inside the Russian command structure. They had communications intercepts. They had defectors. They had a clearer picture of Russian operational planning than Russian commanders themselves did, because Russian commanders weren't communicating with each other. They were communicating only with Moscow, and Moscow was receiving reports filtered through a chain of command, so paranoid that actual information could barely travel upward. Russian generals in the field were discovering their orders had changed by listening to Putin's speeches on state television. They weren't receiving combat updates because the system was designed to prevent independent decision-making, not to facilitate it. Colonels had no authority to deviate from plans, even when those plans were clearly not working. Majors couldn't request air support without going through chains of command that took hours to respond. This wasn't military dysfunction. This was institutional paralysis. The first 120 minutes of the invasion saw Russian forces suffer losses that should have triggered immediate operational reassessment. Dozens of aircraft were shot down or damaged. Dozens of helicopters were lost. Hundreds of vehicles were destroyed or abandoned. Entire units were surrounded or fragmented before they could secure their objectives. But the command structure couldn't respond because responding would require admitting that the plan had failed. Admitting failure meant contradicting Putin. Contradicting Putin meant career termination, at minimum, possibly worse. So instead, Russian commanders kept feeding false intelligence up the chain. They reported success when they had suffered defeat. They requested reinforcements by claiming they were ahead of schedule, not behind. They authorized further advances while previous advances were being annihilated. This created a situation unique in modern warfare. The Russian high command genuinely didn't know what was happening on the ground because the people on the ground couldn't tell them what was actually happening. They could only tell them what Moscow wanted to hear. By the time reports of disaster made it up the chain and authorization for change came back down, the situation had deteriorated further and the authorization was now irrelevant. It was a cycle of mutual deception that accelerated into catastrophe. Meanwhile, Ukrainian forces were fighting a completely different kind of war. Their command structure was distributed, their unit commanders had latitude to make tactical decisions, information flowed upward and downward relatively freely because the entire military culture was oriented toward problem-solving rather than blame avoidance. When a position was untenable, commanders could retreat. When an opportunity appeared, units could exploit it. When plans didn't work, they could adjust. This created a scenario where Ukrainian forces learned faster and responded faster to changing conditions than Russian forces could even perceive those conditions, let alone adjust to them. Hostomel Airport, that critical early objective, fell not because Russian forces were stronger, but because Russian forces couldn't coordinate effectively enough to hold it. They took the airport. Then they couldn't reinforce it because requests for reinforcement went through a broken chain of command. Then Ukrainian forces, coordinating through a functioning chain of command, concentrated forces and retook it. The Russian military had won the battle but couldn't hold the position because the next layer of the operation couldn't execute support operations. And here's where it gets darker. This wasn't a surprise to everyone in Moscow. Some people knew that the command structure was broken. Some people knew that the invasion plan was built on false assumptions. Some people knew that the first hours would reveal catastrophic problems. But nobody in the room with Putin had the authority or the safety to tell him that. The system that Putin had built was designed to guarantee absolute control. It succeeded. And in succeeding, it guaranteed that decisions would be made based on false information, that orders would be executed even when they no longer matched reality, and that the entire military apparatus would lurch forward like a body operating on instructions from a brain that couldn't see anything happening in the limbs. In the first 120 minutes, Russia didn't lose the war because its soldiers fought poorly. Russia's soldiers fought with courage and skill. They lost because they were following orders that had been generated in isolation, executed without feedback, and sustained through a system that punished truthfulness more than it punished failure. The invasion was a test, and what it tested was whether a paranoid, centralized command structure could fight a distributed, adaptive opponent. And the test was over before the first day ended. Ukraine's real advantage in the first hours wasn't military superiority, it was organizational sanity. It was a command structure that could receive information, process it, and respond to it faster than an adversary could even perceive what was happening. And once that advantage became apparent, once Russian commanders realized that their plans were being defeated by Ukrainian adaptation faster than Russian command could authorize new plans, the entire invasion began to show signs of the systemic dysfunction that had generated it. By hour 120, Russian forces had suffered losses that would take months to replace, secured none of their primary objectives, and learned something they couldn't admit, that their military structure was designed for parades and intimidation, not for war against an opponent who could think faster than orders could travel. If you want a detailed breakdown of how exactly Ukrainian intelligence penetrated Russian planning and what the declassified military analyses revealed about command structure failures, I've put together a comprehensive resource that goes deep into the signals intelligence, the human sources, and the organizational theory behind why hierarchical paranoia loses to distributed adaptation. You can find it in the description and in the pinned comment. This is the angle that most military analysis completely misses. Not the tactics, but the system that generated the tactics. Not the hardware, but the decision-making structure. Not the courage of individual soldiers, but the organizational dysfunction that sent them into battle fighting against an enemy they couldn't defeat and orders they couldn't disobey. So when we talk about the first 120 minutes of any major conflict, we're not actually talking about kinetic combat. We're talking about the moment when the losing side didn't even realize they were already losing. The moment when their entire decision-making apparatus had already been compromised, fractured, or made completely irrelevant by the speed of enemy action. And that's exactly what happened to the Russian General Staff in February 2022. They had built an entire military around the assumption that they would always have time to react, time to adjust, time to coordinate. They never factored in an enemy that would refuse to give them that time. The Russian officer corps is built on a doctrine that traces back to Suvorov, to the Imperial General Staff, to the organizational structures perfected during the Soviet era. It is hierarchical, it is centralized, and it operates on the assumption that information flows upward, decisions flow downward, and everything happens in orderly sequence. It is a machine designed to fight other machines built on the same principle. But it is catastrophically vulnerable to an enemy that doesn't fight that way. An enemy that distributes decision-making authority down to battalion and company level. An enemy that rewards initiative instead of punishing deviation from orders. An enemy that treats each unit as an autonomous cell capable of solving problems without waiting for approval from Moscow. By March 2022, roughly 4 days into the invasion, Russian commanders at every level were facing a cascading crisis of information. Their communication networks had been jammed by Ukrainian electronic warfare specialists. Their satellite links had been interdicted by NATO cyber operations. Their radio frequencies were being monitored and sometimes spoofed by Ukrainian intelligence. They were essentially flying blind, making decisions based on intelligence that was already 6 to 12 hours old, sometimes older. Meanwhile, Ukrainian battalion commanders were coordinating real-time responses with each other, with their brigade headquarters, and with NATO liaison officers who were feeding them satellite imagery and signals intelligence directly. This wasn't just a technological advantage, it was an organizational advantage. And that distinction matters enormously, because organizational advantage is sticky, it doesn't fade, it doesn't get overcome by sending in more troops or more hardware. It only deepens as the conflict continues, and one side learns the other's patterns, while the other side can't adapt because their system doesn't allow for rapid adaptation. The Russian 40-mile convoy moving toward Kyiv in the first weeks of the invasion is perhaps the perfect symbol of this organizational dysfunction. That convoy represented approximately 14,000 troops, hundreds of vehicles, and an enormous concentration of target mass. But it was moving under orders issued by commanders in Moscow who had no real-time picture of ground conditions. The local commanders who could see that the column was stalled couldn't make the decision to disperse it or change the route because that would require approval from higher command. So they waited. They sat in that convoy for weeks while Ukrainian drones watched them, while artillery coordinates were calculated, while NATO signals intelligence was monitoring every radio transmission, trying to understand the command structure through pattern analysis. And here's what the classified intelligence showed that most public analysis completely missed. The Russian commanders in the field weren't stupid. They could see what was happening. They were sending situation reports up the chain. But those reports were being filtered, edited, and sometimes suppressed at every level because each commander knew that the person above them had a preset narrative about how the operation should be proceeding. So you had frontline battalion commanders who knew the attack was failing, trying to communicate this to regiment commanders who were trying to communicate this to brigade commanders who were trying to communicate this to division commanders who were trying to communicate this to higher command. And at each of those levels, there was bureaucratic friction, political pressure, and the fundamental human problem of not wanting to deliver bad news to your superior officer. Ukrainian intelligence was seeing all of this. They had human sources inside the Russian military. They had signals intelligence monitoring the radio networks. They had visual intelligence from commercial satellites. And from those three streams of information, they could construct a detailed picture of how dysfunctional the Russian command structure had become. This is something that you simply cannot do if the other side is operating on distributed adaptive principles. You can't penetrate a system where every unit has the authority to make its own decisions within a loose commander's intent. But you can absolutely exploit a system where a junior officer in Kherson has to wait for a decision from a senior officer in Moscow, because that's a bottleneck, and bottlenecks are where wars get decided. By late March 2022, the Russian high command in Moscow began realizing that the northern offensive toward Kyiv was going to fail. But instead of issuing orders to withdraw or reposition, they issued orders to hold ground, to keep attacking, to prove that the operation was still viable. This created an impossible situation for commanders in the field. They had to choose between following orders that they knew were tactically unsound or openly mutinying against their chain of command. Some chose to quietly stop executing aggressive orders and instead focus on holding defensive positions. Others followed the orders and lost massive amounts of personnel, but all of them were trapped in a system that punished both obedience and disobedience because the system itself was broken. And this is where the organizational analysis becomes predictive, which is why military theorists were actually able to forecast Russian failure very early on, not because they had some magical ability to see the future, but because they understood how organizations break down under stress. When stress hits a centralized hierarchical system, it doesn't break randomly. It breaks in predictable places. The chain of command becomes an impediment rather than a tool. Orders become increasingly disconnected from reality, and junior officers stop trusting senior officers because they've repeatedly seen senior officers issue orders that get people killed for no strategic gain. Once that trust breaks, it doesn't come back. It doesn't matter how many replacement troops you send. It doesn't matter how many new weapons you deploy. If a battalion commander has witnessed their regiment commander order a suicide attack that accomplished nothing, they're not going to trust the next order they receive, even if that next order is actually sound. They're going to assume it's another suicide order. They're going to look for ways to minimize casualties. They're going to deploy forces defensively when they're supposed to attack. And the entire command structure starts operating at a different speed than the orders flowing down from the top. The Ukrainian intelligence services understood this dynamic intimately because they were watching it happen in real time. By April 2022, they had enough pattern data to actually predict where Russian operations would stall, where they would try to break through, and where they would start pulling back. It's not magic, it's just organizational theory applied to military operations. When you know how a broken system breaks, you can actually forecast its failures with surprising accuracy, and that's exactly what happened. Ukrainian analysts predicted Russian withdrawal from Kyiv and the northern region, and that withdrawal happened almost exactly on schedule because it was dictated not by tactical considerations, but by organizational collapse. The deeper strategic insight here is that the war was already lost in that first month, not because Russian soldiers weren't brave or well-trained, but because Russian commanders couldn't organize them effectively. The hardware mattered, the tactics mattered, but the organizational dysfunction mattered more. And once you understand that, you understand why the subsequent 2 years of the conflict played out the way they did. Russia kept throwing more resources at the problem without fixing the fundamental organizational pathology. Ukraine kept exploiting that pathology because it only deepened as the war continued. This is the analysis that doesn't show up in most military documentaries because it requires understanding how organizations actually work under extreme stress. It requires thinking about bureaucracy and hierarchy and chain of command, not as background details, but as the primary determinant of operational success or failure. And it's the analysis that makes you understand that when someone asks, how did Ukraine win against a much larger enemy, the real answer isn't courage or determination or NATO support, though all of those mattered. The real answer is that Ukraine's organizational structure allowed their units to adapt and make real-time decisions, while Russia's organizational structure forced their units to wait for approval from Moscow before they could adapt to changing conditions. If you want to understand the full scope of how Ukrainian military intelligence monitored this organizational breakdown, how they actually intercepted and decoded the decision-making patterns of the Russian general staff, and how they systematized that intelligence into predictive models that accurately forecast Russian movements months in advance, there's a comprehensive breakdown available in the description, with additional declassified analysis and tactical timelines. It goes way deeper into the signals intelligence component and the actual organizational theory that made these predictions possible. The lesson for anyone studying military operations, strategic planning, or organizational behavior is clear. You can outspend an opponent. You can outgun an opponent. You can even outman an opponent, but you cannot reliably win against an opponent that can organize faster than you can. And once your organizational structure becomes an impediment to battlefield adaptation, you're essentially in a time delay trap, where you're always fighting the last battle instead of the current one. The Russians were still fighting the invasion plan from February 2022, while Ukraine was fighting the war of April and May 2022. By the time Russia adapted their strategy, Ukraine had already adapted to their adaptation. That's organizational superiority in its purest form. Now here's where the story gets darker, because understanding why Russia lost isn't just an academic exercise, it's a blueprint for how future great powers will fail or succeed in the conflicts coming next. The problem wasn't Russia's firepower. Russia still had massive advantages in artillery, in tank numbers, in manpower reserves. The problem wasn't technology, though that mattered. The problem was the speed of information flow inside the Russian military versus the speed of information flow in the Ukrainian military. When a Ukrainian squad encountered unexpected resistance, that information traveled from the squad leader up to the platoon commander, to the company commander, to the battalion commander, and back down with new orders, sometimes in minutes. When a Russian squad encountered unexpected resistance, that same chain of command often took hours. And in modern combat, hours is the difference between victory and a body bag. This wasn't because Russian soldiers were stupid or unmotivated. Many Russian units fought with extraordinary courage, but they were trapped inside a decision-making apparatus designed for a different era. The Russian military was built to execute predetermined orders from Moscow with minimal deviation. You don't adapt that system overnight. Ukraine, by contrast, had been building a networked military. Small unit leaders had actual authority to make decisions. They had real-time information. They had commanders who expected them to adapt on the fly. That cultural difference, that organizational difference, turned into a massive tactical advantage the moment the invasion started. And here's the brutal part that most military analysts missed in the early months of the war. Russia couldn't fix this problem by sending a memo. You don't overhaul military culture in weeks or months. You can't just upload faster thinking into an organization designed for obedience. So Russia did what it had always done. When faced with a problem it couldn't solve organizationally, it tried to solve it through overwhelming force. More artillery, more missiles, more manpower. And this strategy did work, in the sense that Russia was able to grind out territorial gains through pure attrition. But it came at a cost that the Russian military structure was completely unprepared to manage. By mid-2022, Russia was burning through ammunition at rates it hadn't planned for. Its supply lines were stretched across thousands of kilometers of Ukrainian territory, controlled by enemies who knew exactly where those supply lines were. And the Russian military couldn't adapt its logistics fast enough to keep pace with the losses. A Ukrainian strike team could identify a Russian supply depot, call in coordinates to an artillery unit, and watch in real time as that depot got destroyed. The information loop, see, report, execute, observe, happened in minutes. The Russians, by the time they identified the problem and sent orders to redeploy supplies or change routes, would discover the solution had already become obsolete. The Ukrainians had already found and hit the next depot. This is what military theorists call the OODA loop. Observe, orient, decide, act. The side that can cycle through this loop faster than its opponent wins. Not necessarily because it makes better decisions, but because it makes decisions faster, and by the time the opponent realizes what happened and formulates a response, the situation has already changed. Ukraine was inside Russia's OODA loop. Ukraine observed Russian movements, oriented itself to those movements, made decisions about how to counter them, and acted, all while Russia was still in the observation phase of its own cycle. By the time Russia decided and acted, Ukraine had already moved twice. Now, this advantage didn't erase all the structural difficulties Ukraine faced. Ukraine couldn't manufacture tanks as fast as Russia could. Ukraine couldn't replace manpower the way Russia could. What Ukraine could do was make every tank count, every soldier count, every bullet count. Because information superiority meant no resource was wasted on a futile attack or a defenseless position. By the fall of 2022, Russia had realized something crucial. It couldn't win this war the way it had planned to win it. You can't decapitate a government that's distributed across dozens of locations. You can't demoralize a population when their leadership is visibly alongside them in the foxholes. You can't achieve quick military victory when your opponent makes decisions faster than you do. So Russia shifted strategies again. If it couldn't win quickly through military victory, it would try to win slowly through attrition. It would grind the Ukrainian army down over months and years. It would accept massive casualties as the cost of territorial gain. It would turn the war into a test of which nation could sustain higher losses for longer. And this is where the analysis gets complicated. Because while Russia's organizational problems were real and significant, Russia's ability to sustain massive losses was also real and significant. Ukraine was more efficient militarily, but Russia had more manpower to lose. Ukraine was winning most tactical engagements, but Russia was still making territorial advances through sheer bloody persistence. The question became not whether Ukraine could outfight Russia. It could. The question became whether Ukraine could outlast Russia. And that's a question with a very different answer, because outlasting is less about tactical brilliance and more about industrial capacity, alliance support, and political will. This is the real turning point that most analysts underestimated. By late 2022, Ukraine's survival was no longer dependent primarily on Ukraine. It was dependent on whether the West would continue to supply Ukraine with the weapons, ammunition, and intelligence it needed to sustain the fight. And that became a political question more than a military one. Russia understood this perfectly. It knew it couldn't defeat Ukraine militarily, not quickly, maybe not at all. but it believed it could outlast Western patience. It believed the war would drag on long enough, cost enough money, kill enough Ukrainian soldiers, and generate enough political pressure that the West would eventually pressure Ukraine to negotiate. This became the new war within the war, Ukraine fighting to survive militarily, the West debating whether to sustain that survival, and Russia betting that the West's commitment was weaker than Ukraine's need. But Russia fundamentally miscalculated the psychology of the situation. It assumed Western support would erode like all historical commitments do. It assumed economic fatigue would force political capitulation. It assumed Ukraine would eventually accept unfavorable terms because the alternative, endless war, seemed unsustainable. What Russia didn't account for was that Ukraine was fighting for existence, not territory. When you're fighting for existence, you don't negotiate. You endure. You adapt. You find ways to inflict costs that no amount of patience can absorb. By late 2024, Ukraine had fundamentally transformed its military doctrine. Without air superiority, something it would never have, it became a master of asymmetric warfare. Drone swarms replaced expensive fighter jets. Loitering munitions replaced traditional artillery. Ambush tactics and distributed forces replaced conventional lines of battle. A single Ukrainian FPV drone operator, sitting in a dugout with a remote control, could destroy a tank worth millions of rubles. One person. One cheap piece of consumer electronics modified for combat. The math of attrition suddenly favored the defender. Russia responded by accelerating its own drone production, but quantity couldn't solve the fundamental problem. Ukraine's soldiers were more motivated, better trained in asymmetric tactics, and fighting on defensive terrain. Every Ukrainian soldier held an incentive structure that no amount of Russian military hardware could overcome. Meanwhile, Western military aid didn't just sustain Ukraine, it evolved. Each weapons system that arrived came with months of tactical knowledge embedded. British missile crews trained Ukrainian operators. American artillery advisors fine-tuned targeting procedures. Polish combat engineers shared fortification techniques that had been perfected over generations. Ukraine became a real-time laboratory for how advanced Western systems performed against a near-peer opponent. And every lesson learned generated feedback that made the next shipment of weapons more tactically relevant than the last. By early 2025, the war had reached a critical inflection point that neither combatant had fully anticipated. Russia had expected Ukrainian military capacity to collapse. Instead, Ukrainian ingenuity had transformed technological disadvantage into asymmetric advantage. Russia had expected Western will to fracture. Instead, the West's commitment had calcified into something harder to break, not because of ideological purity, but because allowing Russia to win would reset the entire post-Cold War security architecture. A Russian victory wouldn't just mean Ukrainian territory lost. It would mean Poland questioning its NATO membership. It would mean the Baltics accelerating their own nuclear weapons programs. It would mean every non-aligned nation in Europe making catastrophic hedging decisions. For the United States, the cost of losing in Ukraine was now clearly higher than the cost of sustaining Ukraine. That calculus shifted everything. This is the resource most defense analysts miss when they discuss the Ukraine war. We talk about tank counts and casualty figures and economic sanctions. But the real story is psychological. It's about whose calculus of pain tolerance was built on firmer ground. If you want a deeper breakdown of how asymmetric warfare fundamentally changes military strategy, I've put together a comprehensive analysis in the description and in the pinned comment below that walks through doctrine shifts, drone tactics, and why traditional military strength increasingly fails against distributed, motivated defenders. The second part of this equation, the one Russia absolutely did not see coming, was technological. By mid-2025, Ukraine had begun producing its own weapons systems. Not crude approximations, but genuinely sophisticated platforms. The Palyanitsa drone, for example, a Ukrainian-designed loitering munition with a range exceeding 1,000 kilometers. The system was cheap enough to manufacture at scale, durable enough to survive combat conditions, precise enough to hit targets the size of a vehicle from extreme standoff distances. One drone, one operator, one target eliminated. The cost ratio was catastrophic for any defending force. Russia had assumed it could sustain higher losses because it had a larger population to draw from. But Ukraine had assumed it could make every soldier count by giving them force multipliers that population alone couldn't provide. Technology became the great equalizer. And then there was the economic dimension that everyone underestimated. Western sanctions on Russia weren't designed to destroy the Russian economy overnight. They were designed to create cascading supply chain failures that would compound over time. Semiconductors for military systems became scarce. Aviation components became impossible to source through legitimate channels. Rare earth elements critical for radar and guidance systems became strategic bottlenecks. Russia could still fight, but the technological sophistication of its military hardware declined with every passing month. By early 2026, Russian military equipment was becoming noticeably older, less capable, and more vulnerable to newer Ukrainian systems.
The vaunted Russian military-industrial complex, which had been the backbone of Soviet deterrence, was slowly failing to keep pace. Russia's solution was to compensate with volume, send more soldiers, build more equipment, even if the quality declined, accept higher casualty rates because manpower was still available.
This strategy works when you're fighting a weaker opponent with no external supply line. It doesn't work when your opponent has access to the world's most advanced military technology, and you don't. By spring 2026, Russian casualty estimates had become difficult to calculate with precision. Ukrainian sources claimed 600,000, Western intelligence suggested 500,000. Even Russian independent sources, those few that still operated, acknowledged figures in the high hundreds of thousands. For a country of 144 million people, that's statistically manageable. But it's not meaningless either. Every casualty represents a family, a region drained of young men, an economic disruption that ripples outward. And more importantly, every casualty represents a failure of Russia's original strategic calculation. The war was supposed to be quick, limited, decisive. Instead, it had become an open-ended commitment that would define a generation. The final pivot point came in July 2026. And this is where the story becomes genuinely surprising. Ukraine launched a cross-border offensive into Russian territory. Not a raid, an actual sustained military operation that seized territory inside Russia itself, specifically the Kursk region. For the first time since the Napoleonic Wars, a foreign military had launched a territorial offensive directly into Russian soil. Not a counterattack, not a defensive maneuver, an actual invasion. Russia's response was confused and delayed. Local military commanders didn't have authority to respond with the scale of force that the situation demanded. By the time Moscow coordinated a response, Ukrainian forces had already seized hundreds of square kilometers and established defensive positions. This had catastrophic psychological implications for Russia's entire war narrative. For 3 years, Russia had positioned itself as a defensive power responding to Western aggression. Suddenly, it was Russia being invaded, not militarily defeated, but symbolically wounded. The Kursk offensive didn't break the Russian army, but it broke the Russian information war. Every Russian propaganda outlet suddenly had to explain why Ukrainian soldiers were operating inside Russia. Every domestic audience suddenly had to confront the reality that this wasn't a limited operation in Ukraine. It was a full-scale conflict between two nations. The Kremlin's response was to accelerate its mobilization. By August 2026, Russia was conscripting men from across the entire country. The deferments and exemptions that had previously protected certain regions and certain classes were stripped away. This was total war now. Everyone was part of it. But total war requires total society commitment. Russia's economy was already strained. Military production was working at maximum capacity. Healthcare systems were absorbing casualties faster than capacity could expand. The education system was losing teachers to conscription. Regional economies were losing workers to the front. By autumn 2026, Russian society was experiencing what militaries call strategic exhaustion, not because of ideological weakness or lost will. Russians are historically capable of tremendous sacrifice, but because of the fundamental mismatch between Russia's strategic goals and its actual military and economic capacity to achieve them. Russia wanted to control Ukraine, to subordinate it politically and economically, to eliminate it as a sovereign nation that could potentially threaten Russian interests. What Russia actually got was an open-ended war against a NATO-armed opponent that would require permanent military mobilization and would generate permanent economic costs. The math no longer worked. By November 2026, the Russian General Staff was presenting options to Putin that all amounted to the same reality. Continuation of the war required accepting either massive additional casualties or accepting a negotiated settlement that looked almost identical to the pre-war status quo. In other words, after 3.5 years of fighting, Russia faced the possibility of a peace agreement that would leave Ukraine almost exactly where it started, minus the territory Russia had already taken, which was the entire original justification for the war. This is the point where strategic failure becomes undeniable. A successful military strategy produces a result that justifies its cost. Russia's strategy produced a result that didn't. Worse, every month of continuation only made the result less justified because the costs kept accumulating. There's a deeper resource I've assembled that walks through the actual strategic documents leaked from Russian General Staff discussions, the real calculus of how military strategists assess failure and how institutions respond when they realize they've made a catastrophic miscalculation. You can find the full breakdown in the description and in the pinned comment, where I go into the psychological dynamics that prevent leaders from reversing course even when the evidence is overwhelming. The last piece of this story is the one that most conflicts analysis gets wrong. They focus on the outcome, who won, who lost, what changed, but they miss the mechanism of failure itself. Russia didn't lose the Ukraine war because it lacked military hardware or manpower. It had both in abundance. Russia lost because it fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the conflict it was entering. It thought it was fighting a conventional war of territorial conquest. It was actually fighting an existential war against a nation that had realized it had no choice but victory or dissolution. And when an opponent has nothing left to lose, they're infinitely more dangerous than an opponent fighting for advantage. Moreover, Russia underestimated the West's capacity for sustained commitment. Not because the West was ideologically purer or historically more principled, history doesn't support that claim, but because allowing Russia to succeed would reset global power dynamics in ways that the West couldn't afford. A Russian victory in Ukraine would have meant China could move on Taiwan. It would have meant Iran could move on the Gulf. It would have meant every regional power would suddenly believe that direct military conquest was strategically viable again. So Western support for Ukraine wasn't charity, it was rational self-interest dressed in the language of international law. And rational self-interest is infinitely more durable than charity. This is the real story of how Russia lost. Not in a single day, not in a single battle, but through a cascading series of miscalculations about the nature of modern conflict, the resilience of defenders fighting for survival, the durability of Western commitment when existential interests are at stake, and the capacity of innovation to overcome conventional superiority. Russia's strategic failure in Ukraine is going to reshape military doctrine, defense policy, and geopolitical alignment for the next decade. Every military in the world is studying what went wrong. Every strategic calculation about the viability of territorial conquest is being revised downward. And every nation that might have considered military aggression is now confronting evidence that conventional superiority isn't enough. You need not just military strength, but political legitimacy. You need not just initial momentum, but the capacity to sustain commitment through years of grinding attrition. You need not just